All right. So, little correction first off. I didn't work with Gennady at the AIS. I worked with him in Switzerland with the Swiss Swimming Federation. I'm not quite old enough to have been there at the AIS with him. But yes, I'll jump into the slides hopefully. There we go. So, done the introduction. One little adjustment too is also I also currently work with a startup company called Vol Performance, and we sort of consult in hamstring injury prevention with all sorts of top elite sports teams. So I'm around injury prevention with not just swimmers, but also your top like AFL, NRL teams as well, along with a lot of strength and conditioning. But we'll crack into it. For me today, my sort of goals are to provide a broad overview of the injury prevention approaches that exist, that you've probably been exposed to already, and keep it as simple as possible, because you can go down this rabbit hole with injury prevention, and there's a lot of big fancy words that really mean fairly simple concepts. And for me, in my practice, and then also when I communicate to coaches, there's really a very simple way we can go about it and get most of the way there. Another big piece is also keeping athletes healthy. So keeping them healthy and maintaining that is the easiest way. Prevention is always going to be better than cure. And once you go down this injury pathway, once pain becomes present, and once an athlete is hurt, it's a lot harder to pull them back out of that than rather just putting the work on the front end and keep them healthy throughout. And then also at the end, we're going to go over some very practical ways to apply what we talked about. We'll start a little bit more with theory and then build into it. All right, so I'm sure everyone here is fairly familiar with the incidence of injury in swimmers. The number one thing we see all the time is going to be shoulder injuries. Okay, a number of times you're on pool deck and an athlete says, I'm sore, and they point to the front of their shoulder. We've seen that a bunch, and that's what we're going to focus on towards the end. I feel, from an athletic development point of view, focusing on keeping the shoulder healthy is one of the best things you can do to, first of all, keep them in the sport. When you associate the sport that you love with pain, it's definitely hurts your compliance long term if you play other sports where you don't get hurt. Now, obviously, there's other injuries that come across. From the research, it seems that knee and spine injuries in that order, but there's also all sorts of ankle injuries and neck, general shoulder pain can also get a bit involved there. So, very simple question, why is this injury prevention important? And there's an obvious answer, and then this is what we were talking about. If injuries lead to a loss of training time, diminished performance in those training sessions, diminished performance or missing of competitions, that's a big problem for us. And even more obviously, that someone's done research on this, and they've shown that athletes who fail to train consistently perform worse. Okay, that's pretty obvious, but the data shows it's up to 7 times worse. And it's obvious to us as coaches that we need to keep our athletes training, keep them healthy to be competing well. Now, a less obvious application of this injury prevention is when we think about how pain and injuries, especially in the shoulder, affects the way we can teach athletes and motor control issues. So there's pretty good evidence showing that any sort of introduction of pain in the shoulder or anywhere in the body affects motor control of the muscles in the surrounding areas. So this sort of idea that a little bit of pain we can tolerate, we can swim through, from my point of view, if we're trying to create an optimal environment to teach motor patterns, to teach new skills to athletes, the presence of any sort of pain or injury is really going to diminish the outcomes of our coaching inputs. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. Now for me, there's 3 basic pillars of an injury prevention strategy for your swimmers. First one is load management. Now I saw on the program, you already had a presentation on quantifying load management. Was that today or yesterday afternoon? Now, did he touch on the injury prevention elements of that, or was it more just quantifying load and that sort of thing? Sorry? Just quantifying. Okay, that's good. That means I've got something to talk about. Because we've got plenty of load management stuff that we can do to really prevent injuries, but then also good quality strength training. Now, my background is in strength conditioning, so obviously I'm going to think that's quite an important piece, but there is evidence to support that. And more of the movement quality type of things as well. And we'll break each of these down, we'll go over them, and then look at a practical way to apply each. All right, so load management. And a lot of times I talk to coaches and we bring up this idea of load management. I think you get a lot of resistance on the front end where people think, oh, they're going to tell me I need to train less. And sometimes that's true, but the misconception is that higher training loads always cause a higher rate of training injury. And there's a bit of a paradox here. And some great work by Tim Gabbett has shown that athletes who are appropriately customized to a high training load have few injuries. Now, obviously, there's a limit to that. You can't be swimming 120 Ks a week after week after week, obviously. But if we can get our athletes to a point where they're training consistently and doing a pretty moderate to high workload, the data shows that they're going to be safer than an athlete who's fluctuating or even training less. And as I said, so it's about how we get to these appropriate training loads. And we'll go over the research behind that in a minute. So what we're really looking at, and might maybe mentioned earlier today, is the excessive and rapid increases in training loads, or the spike in training load, are likely responsible for a large proportion of our injuries. And in swimming, it's a non-contact sport, so by and large, a lot of the injuries we're going to be seeing are preventable, non-contact injuries. There's very rare times where someone slips on pool deck or falls off the block or something, but really what we're looking at, most injuries are preventable and they're all from non-contact. It's more of an overuse type of injury. And so when we're looking at this load management thing, they're looking at the interaction of two components. And key components are your acute and chronic loading, and the ratio between the two of those. And it varies from researcher to researcher, but one way to think about it is your acute workload is your most recent week's training load. So how much work you've done in the last week. Chronic is a rolling average of the last 4 or 6, or however you want to quantify it. How did he talk about it? Is that a similar sort of way of thinking about it? Oh, okay, so it's more. Okay, so it's more a physiological sort of thing. All right, so this is, when I'm talking about training load, I'm talking about a very broad categorization of just sort of work done, and we'll break that down a bit further. All right, so load management, how to measure. So when I'm talking about load management here, there's two ways we can think about it. You have either the external load, and that really means what we write down on the board before a session or in the gym or whatever. So we can look at that as either. I'm just going to adjust this. Now, the ways you can look at external load, if you're working with junior athletes and it's not the most sophisticated program, which is absolutely fine, you can even look just at the number of sessions per week. An athlete's swimming 6 to 7 or 3 sessions a week, and that's a metric we can use to monitor the training load of that athlete. Another one we could use for external is kilometers per week. If you want to get more sophisticated too, you can look at various physiological intensities and monitor those. But those are all really looking at how the athlete is just training, just what the external work they are doing is. It doesn't really get an idea of the internal response. And I think as coaches, we all know that the same program written on a board, if that athlete isn't sleeping well, they're fighting with their parents, they're broken up with their girlfriend, that week of training is going to have a different physiological impact than if they're well rested and psychologically switched on. So those are all sort of things to consider. And what we do to consider that is take an internal measure of load. And the classic way that's been done, you may have come across it, we're looking at a sessional RPE rating. So end of a session, about half an hour after, athlete goes 1 to 10 how hard that was, and you multiply that intensity rating across how many minutes the session was. And that gives you a number to sort of look at what that load was for that session. It doesn't really matter whether it was gym or swimming, that's just a good metric we can use. And when we look at that internal sessional RPE training load metric, is where this data really starts to come out and really become interesting. And you can see on the graph there, we have going from left to right is, we have a sweet spot where that acute to chronic workload is between 0.8 and 1.3. And what that really means is that your most recent week of training isn't way less than your average of the last couple of weeks and isn't way more. Once we go too far to the other end, we have that big spike where you have a very hard training week, even an individual session, but we'll think about weeks for now. If you go too far to one end of that spectrum, your risk of injury statistically goes through the roof. And interestingly though, if you do undertrain, you can see the curve goes back up the other way. So if you go from moderate to high workload and drop off and then try and come back especially, there's also a risk. So that consistency in workload and training load is quite important. So another interesting application of this load management in an injury prevention mindset is returning from a break or decreased training workload. And especially if you're working with younger athletes, it's really, really common that athletes will just disappear for 2 weeks. Oh, where'd you go? Oh, my family went camping. And they try and come right back and doing 9 sessions a week. And as a coach, I guess we intuitively know that's not great, but this is the sort of data that gives us guidelines on how to build an athlete back in to the work they were doing. Now, I'm not sure how clearly you can see there, but this is from a white paper published by the AIS. It's freely accessible. I think if you Google it, the title's there. It's a really great one to read and gives a good primer on some of this training load stuff. But for example, if we have an athlete who takes 2 weeks off, is going to take, as I say, 4.6. It's going to take 4.6 of modified workload to build them back up while minimizing risk. Okay, so you can obviously jump right back in, there's nothing stopping you, but if we want to minimize the risk of injury in our athletes, we want to return them to that previous workload that we had developed over a long period of time. And you can see the further along you go that chart, or the percentage of the training you are doing. So even a 2-week period at 40% training takes 2 weeks to build back up. Okay, I'm going to reference that. That's going to be there for you to Google. I think it's a good one for you all to read. Does that sort of make sense so far with the load management in terms of return to play or return to swimming after a bit of a break? Yeah, cool. So something to keep in mind, and it's more an abstract concept, but different tissues also obviously respond to loading and deloading differently. So your bone density or your muscular thickness, the tendon viscosity, these are all parameters that change differently in response to load. And that's something we're going to talk about a bit later when we talk more specifically about the shoulder and some injury prevention. Interestingly, and this has been bounced around before in some conferences I've seen, is the tendon adaptation is a real stickler. It gets hard to manage because tendons adapt slower in a positive sense to resistance training, but they also detrain faster to a detraining effect. So especially in the gym, a great anecdote from me is a buddy I went to high school with, and he was a big gym junkie and used to do just a million curls. And all he did one day, he took like a month off and came back and just did the same gym session again. And his arms, he couldn't move them for weeks. He gave himself massive tendon issues because the muscles stayed pretty strong. What it is more so is that the neurological connection to the muscle stays strong and the tendons get weak quite quickly relative to that. That's the wrong way. Hold on. All right. Right direction now. Now, by no means am I the expert in load management, okay? There's a lot of great resources out there for your coaches to access. Just show of hands, how many coaches here actively use Clearinghouse for Sport? Is anyone actively using it? You got one, okay, a couple. Beautiful. So those of you who are doing it, well done. But I think Clearinghouse for Sport is a great resource put out by, I think it's the Australian Sports Commission, and there's resource after resource. There's all these sort of type of conferences where your best sports physios in the world, your best biomechs, your best sports scientists, they're all there as like a YouTube of all this sort of stuff. It's a bit hard to navigate, but every coach in Australia, I believe, has access to it, or if you don't have it, you can get access to it. It requires a login and that sort of thing. But I definitely recommend going to this Clearinghouse website, having a look, and definitely searching the names Mick Drew and Tim Gabbett. So Tim Gabbett was the guy who did the research that gave us that chart with a sweet spot in the danger zone. Mick Drew is the physiotherapist at the AAS who really is pushing both the AMS and the load management, acute to chronic workload type of work. Also, AMS is a great system, I believe, for utilizing and applying all your load management approaches. Now, whether you have athletes on the AMS yet or not, I'd advise any coach I speak to, as soon as you can get an athlete on the AMS and start looking at these training loads, the better. Obviously, there's a lower limit for age, but when you can, I recommend you do it. So for me, that was a quick run through of load management. I want to keep this a bit more conversational and casual. We can just bounce a couple of questions now from the audience. We have any on load management before I go into the next piece, which is going to be more strength training and gym-based stuff. Do we have any queries on this? And again, I'm not the expert on load management, but I can probably either answer your question or direct you to somewhere you can go. Yeah, mate. Yes, that's a great question. It depends on where we're starting. From my point of view, it's not something that I explicitly consider. I just have and we're going to go over it towards the end, of a progression to build yourself up to a full pull-up, okay? So I generally start, and you'll see this later, I start with sort of things like hanging from a bar, other pulling movements, and then we build ourselves up from there. And usually, if we progress intelligently, we won't run into issues. I generally don't run into tendon issues when I'm progressing athletes on pull-ups. So it's not something I really tend to consider. That is a good question. Any other questions, guys? Fantastic. All right. So strength training and movement quality. And I should say, when I was just talking about load management, in terms of the injury prevention world, there is a lot of opinions, a lot of ideas out there, and very little stuff that's really backed up by evidence. But the load management stuff that we have, and it's coming out of the AAS right now, is really world-class, and it's really, really well supported by evidence. So everything I'm going to talk about now, this movement quality, I believe in it and I practice it, but if you're not, as a coach, taking what is already proven and established, and you should take the lowest hanging fruit, do that first, get your load management in order, and then we can really talk about strength training to augment that, okay? And while I do believe the strength training is a huge piece, if you're not doing load management, everything else sort of falls apart, in my opinion. So for the strength training and movement quality, obviously quite a complex topic. And I'm going to focus on the shoulder for a couple of reasons, because it's a favorite topic of mine. I can talk about it for hours. I'll try not to. but also it's the number one problem we have with swimmers, and I think it's where there's a lot of confusion, and it's not an easy joint to understand, especially shoulder injuries and shoulder pain, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit how long it took me to really get a grip on how the shoulder works and how we can manage it. So hopefully I do a pretty good job today of getting those ideas across. A case study I'm going to refer back to, but it's a good reference for you guys to sort of see that I've dealt with this, and I've dealt with a lot of swimmers, but Ryan Pini would be a great example of a swimmer that I've worked with that illustrates that the way I approach it is effective at the very least. So anyone who's familiar with Ryan Pini, he's a swimmer from Papua New Guinea, but has been trained mostly in Australia. And anyone familiar would know that he's had a history of chronic shoulder pain, and he's had multiple surgeries. I think he's had about 4 by now. All the shoulder cleanouts, joint capsule shortening, all sorts of things. And if you talk to him, he'll tell you about, at the peak of his career, how painful it was and how much it was affecting both him psychologically and competitively. And I started working with Ryan about 1.5 years ago. I was working with Unilateral Park, and he was one of the swimmers there. That's where he trains. And he had never really been able to do any sort of strength and conditioning program effectively. He just sort of accepted, look, I'll never be able to be strong in the gym. I'm just going to have to pop a bunch of Nurofen and deal with the pain and knuckle down. Now, that wasn't acceptable to me when I started working with him by any means. So when I first got Ryan in the gym, it was really quite amazing how weak he was. And I don't think he'd mind me saying that. He's a high-level athlete, swimming quite fast times still, and he couldn't do a pull-up. He had 1 or 2 max, and they were ugly, and he'd fall apart and his shoulders would hurt. On top of that, he was also quite psychologically affected by it. He just believed that his shoulders were weak and couldn't handle any sort of stress. And when you have this belief that your shoulders are made of paper and they're going to fall apart under any sort of load, that really affects the way your body manages pain and that sort of thing as well. So if you may have seen down at Nationals, Pini actually took out the 50 fly. He won. McAvoy technically pulled out, but I'll still take that win. And he posted a career best time at 34 years old, about 23.6. So that's quite a swift time for a guy at 34. And to see an athlete like him who's still getting better and getting stronger at a late point of his age, especially given his history with chronic shoulder pain, is quite a nice one for me. Obviously, part of a larger team, his coach Rob Van der Zand, his physiotherapist Tom Barton played a massive role in getting him to where he is today too. I've got a video coming up just showing where I said Pini, he started, he couldn't even do a chin-up. He was even nervous to hang from a pull-up bar. That's how scared he was of his shoulders. And where I got him to now, we're still training, this is him attempting a 22.5 kilo chin-up, and he ends up getting 2.5 reps. And so for an athlete who was terrified of any sort of weight training, to get him where he is now, and I still think I can get him stronger, but it's a good sign that you can overcome, even the worst athlete with the worst shoulders who is down in themselves, you can turn it around. I don't know how good that video is, but take my word for it. He got 22.5 for almost 3. He got 20 for 3 before, so I was pretty happy with that. So, talking about the shoulder, it's a complex joint, but I'm going to try and keep it very simple. And like I said, people can tend to overcomplicate this. I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible because I think about it in quite simple terms as well. So, to understand it, we've got to look at the anatomy. So what we've got basically, I'm going to point out the key players, and there's a lot of muscles we could learn the names of. I'm not going to really focus on that. I'm going to focus on the key landmarks, the key pieces that we're going to really think about. So we have the scapula, or your shoulder blade, and I'll actually point to that. I'll point that over here. So scapula is here, okay? And that scapula, you've got 2 of them, and they sit on either side of the spine, and they sort of sit on the back of your rib cage, right? And these are quite hard to, they're quite misunderstood in terms of the implication of movements, but they're a vital element that we're going to talk a lot about. A part of the scapula that we also have is the acromion, okay? And that's the key piece we're going to be talking about today. The space below the acromion, all the structures that run through there, and how that interacts in our movement, okay? There's other structures as well, but obviously you've got the humeral head, which is just the top of your upper arm. And you also got the clavicle, but we're not really going to talk about it too much today. But the key pieces from this one, scapula, humeral head, upper arm, and that space of that hook-like thing that comes off the back of the scapula called the acromion. Keep going the wrong way. Now the rotator cuff muscles. And again, very embarrassed how long it took me to actually get these muscles memorized, always get them confused. But basically 4 muscles, they come off the scapula and attach on to the head of the humerus. And these muscles, they have a couple of roles in a very strict mechanical sense. They rotate the humerus. But the primary goal or the primary purpose of these muscles is to maintain the position of the humerus against the scapula. I should actually go back and point out another landmark is this glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa. And that is the little cavity that the head of the humerus sits in and needs to be there stable to allow us to move nice and freely. All right, so rotator cuff muscles. The key one that I'm going to talk about a lot today is our supraspinatus, supraspinatus, depending on who you ask. And you can see here the supraspinatus runs under, look from the front view, runs under that acromion and attaches to the very top of the humerus, okay? And this supraspinatus is the muscle that we always have the problems with. So the tendon of the supraspinatus, also the long head of the bicep is not there, but the supraspinatus tendon is one of the things that is the cause of pain. It's the thing that we're going to be talking about a lot in the coming slides. So if you can just focus on that element, supraspinatus under the acromial arch, from the scapula to the top of the humerus. Cool, and the subacromial space. And so you've probably heard of this when we talk about shoulder pain, swimmer's shoulder. They will say either subacromial impingement syndrome, subacromial pain. That's something you probably heard from a physiotherapist once or twice if you've been a swimming coach. Now, what we're looking at here is the space under well, there it's listed as the coracomial arch, is the under the acromion, okay? So we have the supraspinatus, we have the bursa on top of that, we have the long head of the biceps tendon, okay? And these all sort of converge in this space. And you can see, this is obviously a drawing, but it's quite a cramped space, okay? And it's something we need to be aware of. There's a lot of structures running through there, and how these structures interact, especially under load and movement, is going to be of interest for us. See what I got next. Okay, so scapular movement, and this is where things start to get interesting. So the scapula can move fairly freely. The shoulder's a joint that's got a lot of range of motion. It can move up, it can move down, okay? So that's going to be elevation and depression. It can come forward and back, so protraction and retraction. And the key one that I'm going to be talking about is this rotation. You've got the upward rotation and the downward rotation. Hopefully my next slide, beautiful. This illustrates in more detail the scapulohumeral rhythm, okay? And the key piece is anytime you go overhead, the scapulus must move to accommodate that arm movement, all right? I think I got there. If you're just going straight up, the glenohumeral joint, so that's the shoulder joint that we traditionally think of, gets about 120 degrees of the movement, but then also the scapular movement gives us 50 to 60 degrees of that. So you can see anytime we go overhead, every time we take a swimming stroke, every time we reach to get a box of cereal, okay, it's a system that's working together to give us this movement. And a bit of a detail there, you have 3 muscles, if not more, working together to achieve this movement. We're not going to really talk about that today. The key piece though is if we don't have appropriate movement of the scapula, we're not going to be able to achieve the ranges overhead that we should be able to. And what tends to happen is a pinching or crushing of these structures in that subacromial space. That's one of the models of shoulder pain anyway. So we're going to keep moving forward with this. Okay. A couple of things to consider. You have individual variation, dyskinesis, which is basically a word for faulty movement, and asymmetry. And every athlete we deal with is different. Every athlete we deal with is in a different point of their development. Now, I tend to find young male athletes, especially, have a lot of this scapular winging, which you can see in this middle picture. And basically, scapula just isn't where it should be. It's hanging off the rib cage. I'm sure some of you guys have seen this around. Okay, it's a hard one to deal with, and it's not a very satisfactory answer. Usually, in my experience, time corrects it. Okay, as the athletes grow, they sort of grow into the body, and everything works itself out. In the meantime, we need to consider it and try and correct it. But honestly, I believe I've done a lot of what I thought were fancy interventions, but I think the athlete just got older and bigger and grew into their body. But I'll still take credit for it when I get it. Another thing to consider, you have a scapula of 2 different human scapulas and just totally different shapes. So very narrow on this side, bigger on this side. The acromial arch, the space below the acromion can vary from person to person. The size of the glenoid fossa can vary. That changes all your muscle leverages. It changes a lot of things. So to think that there's one way to move, there's one correct way to look at shoulder movement is a fallacy, okay? We really got to have a broad approach and get some basic guidelines in place. The other one I'm quickly going to touch on is asymmetry. And I think asymmetry is something that gets maybe abused in the sort of sports science world. No human body is perfectly symmetrical. We're always going to be asymmetrical to some degree. Okay. For example, we've got scoliosis, and scoliosis in swimmers is quite common. All right. And the fact that the rib cage and spine are different means the scapula is going to be different, which means the glenohumeral joint is going to be positioned differently and move differently. So to expect to have perfect identical movement in an athlete, especially a swimmer, is a bit misguided. So we need to have a very flexible framework that's going to accommodate all these individual variations and all these sort of different movement patterns. All right, subacromial pain. And like we talked about, there's 2 main camps that talk about how this pain comes about. And the first one I've already mentioned in a fair bit of detail because we're looking at biomechanical structures is the subacromial impingement or pinching. And the idea is that when the shoulder elevates or flexes, that the scapula doesn't move correctly and it causes a pinching of the structures beneath that causes irritation. And over time, you take enough strokes, do enough shoulder movements, those structures start to get quite cranky, they start to hurt. And that's true, okay? There's no real way to get around it, but it might be a bit reductionist in this approach where it's really focusing on just pure biomechanics. The other camp is the tendon-focused explanation, and they're really focusing on loading, so more of the load management stuff we talked about. And it's not so much in their mind the mechanics of the shoulder, it's the fact that this tendon is getting exposed to load, is being overused, and that's providing us the pain. And if you look into the physiotherapy like journals and go to a conference, you'll see there's a lot of debate over these. And now from my point of view, I like to be as simple as possible, so I just think one or both, we'll treat both, fix both, prevent both, and we'll be in a good place. All right, and this is sort of where I'm going to start thinking about today. We have time. Wow. All right. So solutions to the biomechanical hypothesis. All we need to do is develop, restore, or reinforce correct scapular positioning and movement. All right. So we can use our exercises, we can use assistance, we can use TheraBands to get our athletes moving correctly, and hopefully, if we get them to move correctly, we're going to minimize the pinching, minimize the stress on those structures, and we'll have a healthy, happy athlete. The tendon-focused approach is much more about load management, appropriate recovery times, resistance training to increase the health of the tendon. So strength training has been shown to improve resilience of the tendon, improve blood flow, which improves recovery, improves viscosity, improves thickness. So we're going to start looking at some more tendon stuff to get an idea of the side of the camp. I'm going to run over it really quickly, but it's quite important. So here's a model, I think it was published 2010, 2000 something, on rotator cuff tendinopathy. And all it really is, here we have a normal healthy tendon, okay, and then we do something. So we swim, we lift weights, something like that. And so when we do nothing, it underloads and gets worse. But if we apply a load to the tendon, there's a response, it recovers and returns back to normal. And in an ideal world, that's all we ever do. We get a bit of load, a bit of adaptation, and we come back to normal. Now what tends to happen, especially in swimmers, which is understandable because they need to swim a fair bit, we start to push into this end of the spectrum, which is talking about tendinopathy, okay? And definitely what we tend to see is normal tendon, we give it a little bit too much load, we get a slight bit of pain, but usually that pain subsides in a couple of days or even within an overnight, and we come back to normal. It's really important that we consider that we give a tendon the appropriate amount of time to recover between sessions. And if not recovering in time, we need to do something. Either we change the training structure to give it more recovery time, or we try and strengthen that tendon to get it stronger. What happens when things go bad though, is you stress the tendon, we get to this reactive tendinopathy, and then as on this recovery curve, we're coming back to normal, but we do another training stimulus and we get a little bit further down this continuum. We start getting more towards this tendon disrepair and this degeneration of the tendon, okay? And the more we do this, we keep loading, and things start to go quite bad. Tendinopathy is something we want to really try and avoid, and I think even when I have been on pool deck as an assistant coach and an athlete comes saying, oh, my shoulder hurts, like, mate, whatever, get back in the pool. And obviously there's a time and place for that, but when you look at how tendinopathy can affect not just skill learning and skill development, but then also the deeper you go down the rabbit hole, the harder it is to climb back out, like I mentioned. And really severe tendinopathy can take months, several weeks, if not months, to fully recover from. So you've got to really think of what the long-term and short-term gains are. If we're going to push, are we really getting something that's worth 3 months of diminished training? An interesting study that I will mention, I don't have a slide for it, a study called the Seesaw study, and it's one of my favorite studies I've read about this year. Basically what they've done is, common solution to subacromial pain is to create more space. So they do subacromial, can't think of the word. Basically, they clear out the shoulder joint, clear out that space, give you a bit more room. And what they've done, they've double-blinded this. They've got a bunch of athletes, well, I think there's a general population. Half of them have actually gone and done a shoulder surgery. Half of them have gone to a surgical procedure, had their shoulder cut open, and nothing's happened. And they've stitched them back up. So the patient has no idea whether or not they've actually received a shoulder surgery, but the arm's still in a sling. They still take 6 weeks to recover. They still do all the physiotherapy. And what they're looking at is seeing whether or not this surgery actually has a benefit over a placebo. And the data isn't finalized and published yet, but the early markers are looking like, in general population, this surgery is having no real benefit compared to actually not doing anything. And what that implies is it's more the rest and the physiotherapy rehab that leads to the positive results of the surgery rather than the surgery itself. It's quite an interesting study, but something to think about, especially when we've got athletes who are having these surgeries, when maybe if we just actually rested them properly and let them recover, we wouldn't need to do it. More tendon stuff. Okay, I don't mean to bog you down with research type of things, but this is another nice study that is not published, but it's pretty pioneering. It's coming out of both QUT and the QAS. So PhD student, Kirsten Porter, and what she's doing is going to competitive swimmers, which is nice. There's not a lot of research in competitive swimmers. And she's gone around with an ultrasound and measured the subacromial space, so that space below the acromion where everything moves, the tendon thickness, and a couple other metrics by ultrasound. And she's measured that before their morning training, after their morning training, and then before their evening training. So first off the bat, she's found that thinner tendons are associated with a history of pain. So just immediately, if your tendons are small, thin, and weak, is what I would phrase it as, that correlates with a history of pain. What's more interesting is tendon thickness increased after the training session. However, in the healthy group, it returned to normal by the afternoon. So what we have, you have your tendon, you go through a swimming session, it gets a bit irritated, which is totally normal. It's a bit thicker, a bit inflamed, but by the time you get back in the afternoon, if you have in the healthy group, it's fully recovered. In the group with shoulder pain and the group that correlates with a thinner tendon, what's happening is they train, tendon gets inflamed, and by the time they come back in the afternoon, that tendon's still inflamed and hasn't fully recovered. Okay, and that's probably an idea of where our shoulder pain is coming from. It's some athletes can manage it, and we've all seen athletes. There's been guys I've coached who I affectionately called a donkey because I couldn't break him. He would swim a huge amount of Ks, I could smash him in the gym and never get hurt. On the other hand, there's been athletes a bit more like a Ferrari where they need to be maintained and looked after very delicately because either the structures aren't there or there's something else limiting them from being able to recover in time for these multiple training sessions. So for coaches, there's something to consider in terms of how we structure our training and are we giving our athletes appropriate time to recover, especially in their tendons. Also for me, another takeaway is this tendon thickness. One of the things that's been shown to increase tendon thickness is strength training. So coaches tend to ask me sometimes like, mate, okay, cool. So for sprinters, we're fairly confident that it works, but what can you do for distance training, distance racers in the gym? Like, why do they need to be any stronger? They're strong enough already. And for me, the one key takeaway that this study sort of alludes to is that I can, in the gym, give your athletes a greater capacity to back up the training and train harder. So that should be quite interesting for some coaches to hear. If we train appropriately in the gym and improve the thickness of the tendons, hypothetically, we'll be able to improve their ability to back up again and again to train hard. And that's going to be quite important at an elite level. I think that's all I really wanted to mention on that. Yes. Also, something I want to mention before we move into the exercises is a more general shoulder pain. And when we talk to an athlete, they generally point to the front of the shoulder and say, coach, my shoulder hurts here. And that, for me, is an indicator of the subacromial pain. But we can also get some other indications of pain. I'll get a lot of times, I'll point to the upper traps, around the neck, even in the upper middle back. I'm sure you coaches would have seen that. And the sort of trend right now, especially with a lot of physiotherapists and strength coaches, is they look, oh, well, these muscles are tight and overactive. And from my point of view, it's not really that these muscles, well, they are tight and they are overactive, but it's not because they need, the solution to this tight muscle is not just to stretch it out. Muscles get tight when they get overloaded and they're given too much stress for them to handle. So rather than saying tight and overactive, I look at it as being weak and overloaded. And there's evidence to support this, but if we just develop strong, robust muscles that can tolerate these loads, they're going to be able to train better and longer and be healthier, specifically in the upper traps. All right, so before I move on, I'm going to look at some exercises and justify all this sort of stuff. Any questions so far before I look at this sort of thing? No clarification? Makes it, Matt. Yep. Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. General strength training will get it, but the research, and it's again very hard, most of the research is on like the patella tendon and the Achilles tendon. What they look at is a lot of isometric loading with near your sort of 1 rep max, okay? Now, general adaptation to strength training will get thicker tendons. If you want to maximize your tendon thickness, then there's different protocols you could follow. But from my point of view, especially in an athletic development sort of mindset, if we just do good quality strength training, it will get us a lot of the way there. Now, I don't have the metrics to really make specific calls on, well, this athlete's tendon is 20% too thin, I need to increase that. So I don't really go down that road of being super specific, but just general strength training. Yes, it increases cross-sectional area of the muscle tissue. It also increases cross-sectional area of the tendon, okay? But then it also increases the viscosity. Is that a satisfactory answer? Sure. So that's a great point. And that's a really tricky question to approach. So you are right. When we have a limited space, do we really want to have an increase in that tendon thickness that's going to take up more of that space? Is that basically what you're sort of getting at? And I agree. And so a good example would be in bodybuilders who are on quite a few anabolic compounds, and they have massive tendon issues because of the growth hormone. These tendons have grown too big for the structures around them. Now, I haven't seen a swimmer that's gone down that path and gotten too strong in the gym that they've run out of subacromial space. Another finding of Kirsten's work, is there was no real correlation to the subacromial space at rest and shoulder pain, and also the ratio of the tendon to the subacromial space. So it's sort of showing that, yes, the subacromial hypothesis is important, but it's not a direct line from you have this much space free, therefore you're this prone to injury, okay? The research is out. For me, developing a robust tendon, even if we lose a bit of that space and enhance a little bit of that pinching, is an appropriate trade-off in my mind. That's how I think about it. I couldn't give you a strict answer based on research though, unfortunately. So happy with that? Beautiful. Any other questions before we move on? Fantastic. Okay, so sorry, I've categorized for me some of the exercises that I use in a sort of basic progression. Now, the most important thing for me to get across here is there's no one right way to do this. Like I've said, research is sort of hazy, but then also as coaches, your environments are going to be different across the board. So I work with a variety of programs. Some programs have a full-fledged gym with great coaches and all the machines in the world, and I can get really creative and do fancy things. Other programs I work with West Brisbane. Is Oscar here? No, he left. West bloke. I work with Hosco, and we've got a shed, a couple of dumbbells, and a couple of square meters of concrete, and we still manage to get a lot of the work done. So you're going to have to be creative and find solutions. What these exercises for me illustrate are applications of everything we've talked about. And the beauty of it is, apart from load management, good basic strength conditioning will give us good movement quality and increase the resilience of these structures. It will give us the tendons strength that we want, it will increase the muscle mass, and increase the muscle and motor control. So level one for me is isometric cuff work. And I didn't really say at the start, but from this presentation, I'm talking purely from a pain prevention, an injury prevention approach. When an athlete's actually in pain, it's actually quite hard and difficult. And for me, I don't feel comfortable dealing with athletes in pain. And if they have the ability to go see a good physiotherapist, I'm more than happy to send them off. But occasionally I get an athlete with a bit of a twinge, and this is where I start. If their shoulder isn't feeling great, I start with isometric rotator cuff work. Now, I don't have pictures for this, but so an isometric contraction is where the muscle contracts, it generates some sort of force or torque, but there's no movement of the joint, all right? And the best one for me is back of the hand against a wall, you're gonna push out and not get any movement. And I think I've got there, we do 3 to 5 reps of 15 to 30 seconds. We're gonna get an isometric load across that tendon, and this gives us a couple of things. The first thing it gives us is actually a pain relief effect. And this is something that's really, really well documented, that isometric loading reduces pain in tendinopathy, tendinosis specifically. So if you do have an athlete who's either sucked their arm a bit wrong, maybe they've slightly overloaded, or whatever the cause is, we can do this isometric work. It's not gonna aggravate the pain, hopefully. In most cases it won't. And it'll give us a little bit of temporary relief from that pain while they can recover and feel like they're doing something productive. Also, isometric work is shown to improve the health of the tendon in the long term. So you get that short-term pain relief effect, but you're also getting a positive training effect from doing this intervention with the athletes. The other one that I like to do, so we've got the back of the wall pushing up, and what that is doing is working on the supraspinatus tendon and getting a little bit of load across that isometrically. The other one is the self-resisted external rotation, and everyone can actually try this. All you're going to be doing is having your arm by your side about 90 degrees. You grab the back of your hand with the other hand, and you just try and push out in that traditional external rotation motion, but you just resist it and you hold on, okay? And you hold that for 10 seconds, you should start to feel some of the structures in the shoulder get a little bit of load, a little bit of that isometric work, and you can relax. Now for me, it's a bit of a magic trick that I bust out when I work with a swimmer and say, oh coach, like my shoulder's hurting, what can I do? And they do this and they feel better and they're, oh thanks, that's awesome. And I was happy to help them get back in the water. Because for me, my number one priority as a strength conditioning coach is to, number one priority, don't hurt them. Number two priority, especially if they're a distance swimmer, make sure I can keep them in the water as long as possible. Third priority is let's get them stronger and more powerful to bring them some front end speed. Hopefully we get some performance metrics out of that. But those first two are key. Keep them healthy, keep them in the water. And this is one way we can do that with a strength conditioning approach. Yeah, Matt. Yeah, because of the exercise itself, I don't really tell them how hard to go because it's sort of self-limits. It's just as hard as is comfortable. If they get any pain, then dial it back a bit. So it's as hard as is comfortable is generally how I tell them to do it. All right, next exercise. So traditional rotator cuff work. So here's a video I got there. It's kind of choppy. I'm sure you've seen a million flyers that Swimming Australia has put them out, all sorts of physiotherapists put them out on doing these external rotator exercises. And so all the external rotation is this sort of movement at the shoulder or a neutral at this sort of direction. And for me, it depends on the equipment you have available. I personally think a cable machine might be the best way to get that loading, okay, because you get continuous tension across the full movement. But if you've got dumbbells, if you've got TheraBands, if you've got kettlebells, if you've got a partner to sit there and physically resist the movement, it's a nice one that I like to use. But all we're trying to do is get resistance and external rotation and eccentrically on the way back down. Now, the exercise I prefer with a dumbbell is this half kneeling external rotation. So we're going out with an unsupported arm, about 90 degrees, and just moving through this full range of motion all the way up and all the way back down. Pretty simple exercise. I like the half kneeling posture because it takes some elements out of the movement. So if the athlete's standing up, they have to stabilize their spine, they have to stabilize their pelvis. In this position, they're a bit more supported and we can really just look at the shoulder as an isolated unit and see what's going on. The other big thing with your external rotator movement is making sure with any of your shoulder rotational movements is we're moving just at the shoulder joint. If they start moving through the scapula, up and back, then you're moving through a too great a range or they're not being controlled enough. So what I really want is just that rotation, working those rotator cuff muscles through that range. And I do program this for pretty much all athletes. Okay, so all my athletes get some sort of external rotator cuff work, but it's not the only thing I do by any means. This next one, lower trap raise. Now I did realize last minute that I didn't have a good video of this exercise. It's I recorded this yesterday in the gym really quickly. For me, it's one of the go-to exercises for developing or teaching an athlete this upward rotation through arm elevation. Now you can't really see it here. I don't think it's going to loop. But all we were looking at is being in what is similar to a dumbbell row setup. So they're on a bench, but you can do this laying face down on a high bench. You can do it off a Swiss ball. You can do it bent over at the hip. And all we're doing is thumb first, lifting up, and trying to just encourage them to get all the way through and upwardly rotate that scapula. And there's ways you can either physically move them and cue them to do it, or just torture them through the movement. You can show them videos. This is actually quite a complex exercise to coach, but it's one of the best bang for the buck pre-rehabilitation exercises I'm aware of. If you want to know more, come ask me. But there's also a great video on YouTube by Eric Cressy, who's a baseball strength and conditioning coach, and he really runs you through this exercise, all the different variations he uses, all the common problems you see. But this is the number one exercise I use to get my athletes getting overhead healthily. Next one, isometric press hold. And all this is a dumbbell press, but not moving. So we get in that front rack position, hold it, and count to 15. And we do, just like I said before, 3 to 5 sets of 15 to 30 seconds. And it's a good way to get some isometric loading on the cuff, so we get a bit of strength without provoking too much pain if they have it. Also can reduce pain in certain athletes. You can hold at any point during the range. But for me, if I got an athlete who can't press, either their shoulder doesn't move correctly or they're in too much pain to press properly, this is where I start them. So they're sitting there, nice little posture, holding, because if they weren't working, the gravity would just pull them forward and down. So they're working all the muscles through their posture, through the scapula stabilizing, and also the rotator cuff. So this is a precursor to my pressing movements, but it's a great one to get started with. Now you can load it in various ways. You can hold a dumbbell, you can hold a kettlebell. Anything that's heavy and holdable is useful. Next one, overhead shrug. Let this video play. Yeah, okay, we've got a bit of movement. So again, we're in this half kneeling posture, good stability to the core and hips, okay, so that's taken care of. And all we're doing, starting overhead with a slightly bent elbow, and we're just going to focus on shrugging that shoulder blade. So we're really focused on direct elevation, just going up and down. But it's a really important way to develop some strength through those upper trapezius muscles, and also a synergist muscle is your serratus, and they're going to need to work together. And shrugging here is actually very different to shrugging here. And when we're working with swimmers, they're going to be shrugging here. So we need to develop this pattern and to be effective and controlled through the full movement. And what you'll tend to see with athletes is, especially if they've done a bit of gym previously and they've done a bunch of shrugs trying to get huge, when you put them overhead, they'll be a little bit funny on this side and they'll just drop. And they won't have motor control through that full range. And what this exercise teaches is control through the full range of movement of the scapula. And something I'm going to keep talking about is a good strength program. We develop control and correct movement in our programs. Phil, that's good exercise. You can, again, do it with a kettlebell, do it without anything. You can do it bilaterally. A lot of the examples I have here, though, are using one arm rather than two. And the reason why, I'm trying to make these as user-friendly as possible. And so if you do have a swimmer with some sort of asymmetry, whether they've got scoliosis, whether they've got different scapulas side to side, whether they've got a history of injury, you're going to want to allow some freedom of movement between those limbs to move in the most natural way possible, rather than trying, if you put a barbell there, you're forcing both arms to move together. You're tying different limbs together, and then you might not get the most natural movement pattern. All right, bilateral. Exact same concept, but you got two. I think if the athlete's healthy and fairly symmetrical, you should do both. I definitely program both. I will talk about how to program and organize all this later. I'm just going over the exercises. Any of the exercises so far, any clarification? Yeah, I'm running through these and I sort of see these all the time, so it might not be as clear. No, fantastic. Sorry. I'll get to that at the end. This is also in the programming thing. All right, now overhead press. Again, you can see I like this half kneeling posture. I think it's a great way to set up your athletes when doing any sort of upper body movement. Starting, nice solid front rack, vertical forearm, and they just press. I just tell my athletes to press. I don't try and get too specific in movement paths. Generally, gravity will teach them the most effective way once you start to get heavy. You might see some weird things when they're learning, but if you give your athletes an opportunity to learn how to move, they'll generally sort themselves out pretty close to what you would be optimal or optimal. I like to allow a natural rotation on that dumbbell. I think the shoulder joint wants to rotate as you go overhead, especially under load. You notice with this, just smooth movement. There's no jerking, there's no punching, there's no dropping, under control, 2 seconds up, 2 seconds down if you want to counter that way. Nice, smooth, coordinated movement across the shoulder joint. For me, this is one of my go-to once I've got a healthy athlete. For example, with Ryan Pini now, it took me maybe 3 to 6 months to build him up to the point where he could press without his shoulder clicking, without pain, without all sorts of weird stuff. But now that he can press, I keep him pressing two to 3 times a week. There's good research to show in these pressing movements, any sort of shoulder flexion, the supraspinatus is active. Okay, so any sort of pressing is you can think about it as a similar concept as an external rotation. Most of what you'd get from doing a strict external rotation movement, you're going to get from doing heavy pressing. You can get pretty heavy on this as long as the form is fine. I don't do a lot of barbell pressing for that same reason I mentioned before. I think you need to allow for these asymmetries. You want to allow for natural movement. But if you have athletes who want to do pressing, you want to do bilateral pressing, by all means get after it. This is another one, again, for me with Ryan, but all my athletes, I think this is a great exercise. And all we're doing, standard overhead press, but now with a kettlebell inverted. It looks a bit silly, and sometimes these exercises, do look a bit crazy, a bit circus sideshow-ish. But the benefits of this one, really, when you put the kettlebell in this position, you move the center of mass to above your hand. And all of a sudden, you've created an instability that your shoulder has to manage. So all through the chain, the wrist through the elbow, the shoulder joint, and the rotator cuff, they're all working not just now to press the weight, but to stabilize it. And developing the ability to stabilize the shoulder is key for me in swimming. I think it's one of the limitations in some athletes. If they can't appropriately stabilize the shoulder under load, they're not going to be effective swimmers. What I do see plenty of times, especially boys of mine that come from another program, they've done a bunch of barbell pressing, they've done a bunch of bench press, and they're pretty damn strong. But then you give them this and they can't handle 8 kilos because they don't have this complex motor control. I think it's a key piece to get your athletes healthy and moving well through that shoulder joint. Now, another one, and these are all simple movements. I think sometimes in strength and conditioning, we try and prove how smart we are and look at this crazy TheraBand, one-legged thing we're doing. For me, the basics get you a long way there, and the push-up is a great exercise. We're working the scapula through a good range of movement, we're stabilizing, and we're working those muscles across that joint. It's also a good opportunity to work on posture and position, okay? So you see this athlete is pretty good with it. Long neck throughout the movement. He's in a neutral spine position. You can do push-ups in a swimming-specific flat back position if you like. For me, from a core stability point of view, this push-up is basically a moving plank, okay? So why do a front plank for 30 seconds when you could do 10 push-ups instead? You're getting bang for your buck. You're getting 2 exercises in one if you do it properly. Now, I've moved past sort of the shoulder rehabilitation exercises from a point of view, okay? All the pressing, so I'll go back because I want to talk through this video. So far, everything we've done is about developing integrity through the shoulder and increasing the strength of the cuff and what you sort of expect from a more traditional injury prevention approach. But for me, a well-designed, complete strength and conditioning program is injury prevention. And a pull-up is a vital exercise for any athlete, especially so for swimmers. Now, whether you want to go crazy heavy with the weight is a coaching decision you need to make. For me, I think sprinters should go heavy. Distance guys, you can make a call on that individually, okay? And really, when I sit down with coaches, 50 and 100 swimmers, generally, I want to get them stronger. When you start getting 2, 4s, 1500s, okay, do we need to get them faster? If their front end 50, 100, whatever is quick enough, then maybe there's other things we can work on. Maybe we can just keep them healthy so they can swim more. If you're trying to chase speed, get strong. If you're trying to chase something else, maybe look somewhere else. So, the pull-up. Great way to great way to work the other muscles around the shoulder. And you can see, so this is a girl, I think she's like 14. Just watch this video, there's 3 reps, and just look at the strictness in the form. So you can see barely any movement at all through the body. This for me isn't a perfect rep, but it's pretty close. Okay, good control, body is totally stiff, and it's just moving through that shoulder joint. Okay, and I'm quite happy with that sort of technique. Now for me, in all your pushing, pressing, whatever movements, we really want to maintain a good posture, because if you can't express the range of motion of all your joints while maintaining integrity here, then how are you going to swim effectively? Okay, if we've got athletes who are doing pull-ups and swinging into it, or they're pressing and dropping, and then we try and get them in the water and tell them to swim freestyle with strict control, we've really got 2 opposing sort of forces here. So in the gym, I'm always looking at my athletes saying, how can we get better control through our midline? How can we get better control through our head position? And the cues I use to achieve this, first of all, you got to have a pull-up bar that's high enough. If you don't have a high enough bar, then they can bend their knees and find a way to get there. But for the pull-up, I'm looking at a long neck, big chest, and then strict control. Another extra point with the pull-up is I change the point of focus. Most of the time when you throw an athlete on a pull-up bar, they're thinking, all right, how do I get my chin over this bar the easiest way possible? And I think that leads to a lot of problems. You get athletes who sort of bend up at the neck and they start really like working hard to get their neck over the bar. All I really care about is completion of this shoulder movement. I'll go back and play it again. I've gone too far. Hold on, there we go. You're gonna play. I'll get there eventually. If you look at the shoulder, at the elbow, so all we're really doing is getting that shoulder, upper arm in line with their torso. So she's going to complete shoulder extension, and that's the end of the rep. If their chin's 3 inches above the bar, an inch below, perfectly in line, I don't really care. All I want to get is perfect completion of shoulder extension. And that applies across the board for all our rowing movements. So again, another solution, you need to do rowing movements with your athletes, especially who was talking about pull-ups. If you can't get them to do pull-ups, you can start with just general rowing movements. You can also do band-assisted pull-ups is another good way to get there. If you have a lat pull-down machine, I'm not a massive fan of them, but they're a good way to build into developing the strength to do a full pull-up. Hanging rows, for me, if they can't do pull-ups, we start here, okay? So you have the feet elevated, same as before, perfect position through the body, nice long neck, big chest, and just utilizing those muscles to move while maintaining rigidity through the rest of the body. If they are too weak to do this, then you can take the box away. It's going to change the leverage. If that's too hard again, you can change the ring position and have them sort of half standing up. So there's always ways you can progress these rows. But if you don't have rings, if you don't have a box, you can use a dumbbell in that classic bodybuilder dumbbell row. I don't mind as an exercise. If you have a cable machine row, get after it. There's a million ways to get these movements as long as you're getting them in an effective way. Let's keep moving. All right, programming basics. Now, this isn't a course on strength and conditioning, how to organize a gym session. And like I said, everyone here is going to have different constraints on their environment, whether you actually have a gym, whether you have a coach available to coach these athletes through the movements. But very, very broad guidelines. What we want to do is expose our athletes to a wide variety of intensities and exercises. Okay, so there's no one perfect way. And to go back to the tendon question I had before, I think if you try and get too specific in, oh, well, this research shows that 70% of your maximal rep max, you get ideal tendon adaptations. Okay, that's great, but it's so gray and cloudy. With young athletes, all I want to do is expose them to a variety and a fairly even variety. The only limitation on that is the age. So age sets a limit on how hard we can go in the gym. And these are some fairly conservative numbers. I'm not sure what the F10 model is going to prescribe, but this is from the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association. And this gives you some guidelines on how heavy you can lift with a certain age of athlete. And so it's based on what's called a repetition max. And so, for example, your 1 rep max is the max weight you can lift for 1 rep. The 5 rep max is the weight you can lift for 5 reps. It's quite a simple way to look at it. And we're looking at, on that table, we have your age at the top. So a 6 to 9-year-old athlete, based on this guideline, should only be doing weights that they could do 15 technically correct reps with, okay? So if they can't lift it for 15 reps, it's too heavy. Now, this is quite conservative, but when I'm talking to swimming coaches, I think this is the way to keep everything quite safe. If you have a strength and conditioning professional there to really monitor things and take some risks, but I don't think it's worthwhile really, unless you've got an early high-performing athlete. So 6 to 9, any of these movements, 15 plus reps, if they can't get 15 reps, reduce the weight or vary the exercise so they can. So they can go to push-ups on their knees. They can go to band-assisted pull-ups. There's ways to get all of these exercises working. By the way, you don't have to scribble this down. You just Google ASCTA position stand resistance training. It's not too hard to find, but it's not that hard to write down either. 9 to 12, 10 to 15 rep range. You can always go above it, but as always, when you start going above 15 reps, you stop getting much of the muscular adaptations that you would be looking for. You're getting more of an endurance effect. So that's 6 to 9-year-old age. We're getting a little bit of an effect. It's more to teach and learn those movements in preparation. 9 to 12, 10 to 15. Once they get to that 12 to 15-year-old age group, we can actually start training with some intensity. And a proper 8-rep max is quite challenging. You can get a bit of a sweat on, and you get some good adaptations out of it. You can get some good growth, some muscular development. You can get some good strength development as well. And as we go down, 15 to 18, we start lifting heavier. And for me, generally, unless I've got an athlete who's really needing to get after it and they've got some performance demands, I don't really tend to go harder than a 6-rep max unless they're over 18. From my point of view, you can get what you need without going that heavy, and you minimize the risks. Now, more programming information. Now, this is always hard depending on who you're talking to. The really broad guidelines I look at is ideally 2 to 3 sessions a week of 30 to 80 reps per muscle group in that intensity bracket. So that could mean 2 sets of 15. It could mean 3 sets of 10. It depends on what the athlete needs and what you're getting at. But if you're doing 2 to 3 sessions a week, you're going to accumulate enough work to get what we want out of that gym program. You can get by with 1 gym session a week, but from my point of view, 1 session is not enough to provide appropriate stimulus without them getting too sore. So if I've got 1 session a week to work with an athlete, I need to train them so hard in that 1 session that they're going to be sore for 4 days, and you diminish their training time in the pool. Other programming considerations to take in is, what are you doing? Are you doing circuits? Are you doing structured S&C work? Or are you so tight at time that you can do 5 minutes of prehab work at the end of the session? And that's something I want to talk about now too, is when do we place these dryland sessions? If we're doing some sort of fatiguing resistance training work, I think we're going to get it behind any important training sessions, okay? For me, there's no real point in massively fatiguing an athlete. If we're doing this sort of work, we're going to fatigue them and then go, all right, now go swim perfectly. It's just not going to happen. So what I try and do when I talk to coaches, when it allows it, is if we've got a key set, and say you've got 3 or 4 key sets a week, making sure that gym is placed around them so they interfere as little as possible. And the best situation I've been in is when I was actually coaching in China, because we had a perfect sort of facility and an open timetable, is that sort of 3 mini cycles in a week where you had a Monday morning, Tuesday evening swim, Tuesday morning swim, and then a gym session, and then a full 36 hours of recovery. Okay, and then what that allows us to do is go hard in the gym without any real concern that they're not going to recover in time by Wednesday morning. Problems start to come up from my point of view is, especially, and I see some high performance teams doing this, where they have to do their S&C off-site. So they train in the morning, 5 to 7, whatever, and then they might do a gym session at noon, and then they're back in the water at 4. And based on that study from QT we're talking about, you're swimming in the water and you're stressing the tendons in your shoulder. Then you go into the gym and you're stressing the tendons in your shoulder, and then 4 hours later you're back in the water again, and you're not really allowing that adequate recovery time. So again, everyone's got their own different environments they've got to manipulate, but these are the sort of things I'm looking at. While we're still talking about programming basics, yeah, Now we're on programming. Now this is where I can get into the real nitty gritty. I imagine I have quite a few questions about how to apply everything we just went over. We'll just run some questions for now, and then we'll finish up. So any questions based on the programming approaches to these exercises? Or did I explain it that well that I have no questions? All right. In summary, really simple. If we manage our training load and then develop a strong and stable shoulder that moves well, we're 90% of the way there to managing our injury prevention for our athletes. Cool. So that's for me on the injury prevention side of things. And we touched into some of this athletic development, how to get a dryland program that is going to facilitate the best performance of our athletes in a young age. Any questions off this before we move into athletic development? Yeah, mate. Yeah, cool. So I intentionally didn't really talk about it. It's in the movement quality. It falls under movement quality for me. Tom Barton's going to talk about flexibility, and he's a yoga instructor, physiotherapist, and he's going to give you all the information you could possibly need. But yeah, flexibility is good. It's just a matter of where you prioritize it. And what I tend to see in a lot of athletes is they want to get good at what they're already good at. So the guys who are super flexible, they're going to go off and do yoga because they're good at yoga. But really, they should be in the gym getting strong. And the boys who are super tight and strong are already in the gym and they're doing any piece of yoga or stretching. So that's a good indicator. Whatever they want to do, maybe don't let them do that and think about what something else they could be doing. But obviously, yeah, flexibility is important. As far as flexibility relates to injury prevention, it's iffy. But if you can't achieve your correct positions in your swimming stroke and you've got to cheat to get there and you've got to crush that subacromial space, then obviously it's going to be a factor in your injury. I'm just going to open up to more general questions. Anyone got questions? No, cool. Now, I didn't really organize a whole lot of slides on athletic development because I think it's more of just an open conversation. I'm going to throw out a basic sort of position stand that I have, and we're just going to talk about a couple of things. And for me, for athletic development, and we've seen a bit of it from Stefan, seen a bit of it in that previous presentation, all I'm really looking to do when I look at an athlete is provide them with a rich learning environment of various motor tasks. So that's going to be running, it's going to be jumping, it's going to be landing, it's going to be throwing, it's going to be balancing on one leg, it's going to be various sports. And how we achieve that for athletes is really going to depend. And you need to look at what your athlete is doing when they're not in the water. So if they go to a school that has an awesome PE program, maybe most of your athletic development stuff is already taken care of. A good PE program will do a lot of the stuff, maybe not the strength stuff. But there's some private schools that do awesome strength and conditioning with young athletes. If you've got an athlete who's potentially homeschooled and does nothing but swim, then you might run into some problems. And an example from when I was working in China, what they do is very brutally at a young age, talent identify someone, and now you're a swimmer from 8 years old and you don't do anything else. And so we had athletes who were great swimmers, but they couldn't run, they couldn't jump, and that sort of stuff really gets exposed, especially on their starts and turns. And where we made a lot of progress with our guys is teach them how to do these basic things, build them up, get them strong, and their skills really improved as a result. When we look at how the human body learns to move, there might be a bit of a confusion in terms of the way we think about it. Sometimes we try and break it down and try and develop a model in our mind where we have all these individual components that get pieced together for a final product. And it's, in the movement literacy sort of terminology, they're talking about, you got to learn your ABCs. And that's not an appropriate model, but something I want to express to you guys is we don't actually learn to speak that way. Like, we could speak long before we could read or write. How we learn to speak is by observing our environment and interacting. And that's the same way we're going to be doing it when we learn how to move. When a baby learns to crawl, we don't have to teach it how to crawl. We put it in an environment and the body organizes itself in a way to achieve these outcomes. And what we're looking to do from an athletic development point of view for me is just create environments that challenge the athlete, challenge them to learn how to move, and challenge to find new movement solutions to the tasks at hand. So for example, with running is obviously important, but running on grass, running on sand, running backwards, running uphill, running downhill, there's all different ways that I can expose them to something different. And whether you're doing that in the context of a game, whether you're playing touch football on a slight incline, whether you actually give them a task and you've broken it down to a specific drill, whether you're doing something in the gym where it's a very explicit exercise where you're going to teach them how to jump and land. There's all different ways to get that exposure to that type of work. I do have a couple of videos of other exercises that I use. I'll see if I can pull them up. Are you going to be good to show like videos I play? We'll find out. Oh, nice. If I just pull them up, they'll play. Cool. So in a more general strength and conditioning sense, here's a bunch of exercises that I use to get with junior athletes some of these improvements. So we've done a lot of upper body, we've done upper pushing and pulling, but in terms of lower body strength training, we haven't really touched anything. So for me, a great place to start with an athlete is in a split squat position. And you can see it's quite similar to what we were doing before in terms of that half kneeling. And what I'm looking for is a 90-degree angle, that front knee, back knee straight down, and all we're going to be doing, if I press space, no, hold on, there we go. Ooh. Is it lagging out or? Might have technical issues. Yeah, that's a flash drive. Might be too slow. They're pretty big files. Maybe I can just work around it. That's right. All right, so if we don't get these videos going, we'll have to find a way to explain this anyway. But there's some very basic movement patterns we can work. And one's going to be that split stance position where we're starting pretty long. You just get that freeze frame up. I don't need to actually move. Oh, there we go. Good bloke. I won't try anything else. We'll just play that. So watch that while it's on, while it's working. All right, stop there. Cool. So that is our basic split squat. And for me, it's the easiest way that 90% of the athletes that I work with can do this on day one. So you're going to get some athletes who can't barbell squat, or you don't have a barbell, or you don't have a squat rack. So they can start doing this body weight, or you can start loading it with a dumbbell. But for me, getting a squat pattern where you're working your knee and your hip through that range, this is the best way to get it. And you can really load it quite effectively. And you can use this in a warm-up, you can use it in a strength conditioning program, you can use it in a prehabilitation program at the end. But it's a good way to go about it. So that's our split squat. I will try and just show you one more, if that works. What did you open it with? Media player? Yeah, cool. I got it. Okay, it's good. I think I got it. And so this is another way to get the back of the hip. So we've got the front of the leg and the glute. This way to get the hamstring. Okay. Single leg RDL. If you Google this name, it will come up with some great exercise videos, better quality than this one, I guess. So we're standing on one leg, nice and tall, and we're hinging at the hip, and we're getting the hamstring. So those two exercises I showed you, you got the squat variation, you got a hip variation, you got all the upper body movements we talked about. And a very broad sense that I think about strength and conditioning programs is we've got a couple of key movement patterns. We have a horizontal press, a vertical press. We have a horizontal pull and a vertical pull, okay? Then we have a squat pattern and we have a hip dominant pattern. If you hit all of those, you're almost gonna hit every muscle in the body fairly sufficiently. And when we're talking about programming, I'm going, all right, I want 30, 60 or 80 reps per session per movement pattern. So if you do double leg squats and split squats and you accumulate those reps, that's what I'm looking to do, if that makes sense. Breaking down into 5 broad categories. There's also core and hip flexor stuff, but that's gonna have to come for another day. Cool. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to dump out of my brain for injury prevention. Hopefully that answered a lot of questions. I'm going to ask again, if there's any questions, we can go over them now. If you want to talk in private about your specific program and any issues you're having, I'm going to be hanging around to talk to. So any questions before I finish up? Yeah, mate. Yep. Yeah, so it depends. Yeah, so it depends where you're at. For me, so where I'm at with someone like Ryan now, his strength and conditioning program is his injury prevention program. I don't need to do too much else. If in an earlier day with an athlete like Ryan, what I was doing was, okay, so his shoulders are erect, but his hips were actually pretty good. So he could do his heavy squats, and then in between those, we're doing his rehab exercises. Of course, also you got your dynamic warm-up, bit of plyometric work if you're getting a bit more advanced, then into traditional strength training, foam rolling, flexibility at the end. That's a general way to go about it. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, mate. This one, so that would be a single leg Romanian deadlift. Yeah, so this is, you won't find mine, they're not published yet. No, what we're looking for, generally this, because it's such the type of exercise, you won't find a lot of nonsense online with this specific exercise if you Google that specific phrase. Yeah, but with any sort of deadlift, we're looking for a flat back, clean movement, and I'm pretty sure you'll find something quite good. If not, mate, email me and I can send you these files. Yeah, so something I probably should talk about more in hindsight is I don't like doing a massive amount of what I would call injury prevention work before you get in the water, because for me it's resistance and it's a fatiguing thing to create an adaptation. So if you get a young swimmer and then you do a bunch of rotator cuff work, now you can do warm up, that's fine. Warming up your rotator cuff is a totally different animal. But if you're actually trying to stress the rotator cuff and make it stronger, you want to do that after you swim. Okay? If you do that before, you're going to just send an athlete into the water with a diminished ability to stabilize their shoulder, and that's not a good time for anyone. Is that? Yeah. Got a couple other hands, or not? Cool. I might wrap it there. Thanks, guys. Feel free to come up and talk to me later. Cheers.
Thank you, Scott, for a really interesting presentation. On behalf of ASCTA, again, thank you.